The thunder split the midnight sky like the crack of God's own whip, each lightning flash illuminating the flooded cellar where Elise Harper clung to consciousness. The contaminated water had risen to her collarbones, now carrying the stench of rot and decay that made her stomach lurch even as she fought to keep her head above the surface. Iron shackles bit deep into her swollen wrists, the rusted metal leaving festering wounds that burned like fire every time she moved. 8 months pregnant and chained to the stone wall like an animal, she pressed her back against the cold rocks and tilted her face toward the ceiling, catching precious drops of rainwater that seeped through the rotting floorboards above. Her once golden hair hung in matted tangles around a face hollowed by weeks of starvation, and her belly, swollen with the child of her tormentor, contracted with increasing frequency as labor threatened to begin in this tomb of filth and despair. 28 scratches marked the wall beside her head, one for each day, since Amos Voss had dragged her from their cabin and thrown her into this forgotten hell. 28 days of praying someone would notice her absence, that someone in Cinder Bluff would care enough to search for the missing stepdaughter of the territory's most feared landowner. But prayers seemed as distant as salvation when the water reached her chin and kept rising. A sharp crack echoed from above, wood splintering under force. Elise's heart hammered against her ribs as the cellar hatch burst open, admitting a sliver of storm-torn darkness and the silhouette of a man she had never seen before. Lightning illuminated his face for an instant, angular features marked by a jagged scar, long black hair braided with eagle feathers, and dark eyes that blazed with something between fury and determination. He descended the treacherous ladder with the silent grace of a hunter, water cascading from his buckskin clothing as he dropped into the flooded chamber. When those eyes found hers across the shadows, she saw recognition flicker not of her face, but of her suffering. "My name is Tokala," he said in careful English, his voice carrying the weight of mountains. "I have come for the man who cages you like this." Elise Harper's world had crumbled piece by piece, starting 5 years ago when her parents died in what the town called a tragic accident. John and Mary Harper had been honest settlers claiming fertile land through backbreaking labor and careful savings. But their wagon overturned on a mountain pass known for its safety, crushing both beneath tons of rock that seemed to have fallen at precisely the wrong moment. Within 6 months, Amos Voss had married her grieving mother with promises of protection and prosperity. A wealthy landowner with fingers in every corrupt deal from cattle rustling to fraudulent mining claims, Amos commanded respect through fear rather than admiration. His marriage to the widow Harper was seen as an act of charity by those who didn't look too closely at the circumstances. The charity lasted exactly 2 years. Her mother's death, officially ruled an accidental fall down the stairs, left Elise alone with a man whose gentle courtship had concealed the soul of a predator. She had found her mother's body at dawn, finger-shaped bruises dark against the pale throat, and known with terrible certainty that Amos had finally tired of his charade. The first assault came that very night. Elise was 21, still wearing black mourning clothes, when Amos forced himself into her room with whiskey on his breath and violence in his eyes. Her screams brought no help. The nearest neighbors lived miles away, and the household staff had been dismissed after her mother's funeral. "Who would believe you?" Amos had whispered afterward, his breath hot against her ear. The poor, grieving stepdaughter making wild accusations against the man who took her in out of kindness. They'd say grief had driven you mad. The assaults became routine, methodical, each one accompanied by threats of what would happen if she spoke a word to anyone in town. When pregnancy became undeniable, Amos's mask slipped entirely. He spoke openly of his plans to keep her hidden until the birth, then dispose of both her and any evidence of his crimes. But Elise had discovered something in his study that changed everything. Hidden in a false drawer were documents that revealed the true scope of Amos's empire correspondence with corrupt federal agents about native land seizures, receipts for bribes paid to railroad officials, and most damning of all, detailed records of human cargo shipped to buyers in distant cities. Young women, many of them native, described in the cold language of livestock. When she confronted him with these papers 4 weeks ago, demanding he let her leave Cinder Bluff forever in exchange for her silence, Amos had struck her unconscious with a fireplace poker and dragged her to this cellar while she bled. "You've seen too much, my dear," he had said while bolting the shackles to the wall. "But you're still valuable merchandise. The buyers pay premium prices for pregnant women, two for the price of one, as they say." For 28 days she had survived on scraps of moldy bread and rainwater, sustained by one unshakable truth: the child growing inside her was innocent of its father's sins, and she would endure any torment to see it born free. Now, staring up at the Lakota warrior who had somehow found her, Elise wondered if that freedom might actually be possible. Tokala moved through the waist-deep water with careful purpose, examining the iron shackles that held Elise prisoner. Each chain was secured to the stone wall with spikes thick as a man's thumb, driven deep into mortar that had hardened over decades. Her wrists and ankles were raw meat, where the metal had chafed and infection had turned the wounds a sickly green color. "How did you find me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Nana I have been hunting Amos Voss for 6 months." Tokala replied, testing the strength of the first chain. "Since the night federal agents stole food, meant for my people leaving my sister to starve, while their leader grew fat on bribes." His hunting knife was razor-sharp, honed to perfection through years of use. Instead of trying to break the chains, which would create noise and likely fail, he worked the blade into the narrow gap between shackle and spike. Using the knife as a lever, he twisted and pried, applying pressure that made his shoulder muscles burn with effort. "Your sister," Elise asked, desperate for any distraction from the rising water that now lapped at her mouth. Something dark flickered in Tokala's eyes. "Winona. 16 summers old, gentle as a doe, quick to laugh." His voice carried across the water like a prayer for the dead. "She died believing I would return with enough food to see her through the winter. Instead, I was thrown from the reservation in chains, branded an outlaw for striking the agent who murdered her with his greed." The first spike began to work loose from its ancient bed mortar, crumbling as Tokala applied leverage with patient determination. Above them, thunder crashed with such violence that dust rained from the ceiling, and in the distance came the sound of men shouting, voices carried on the storm wind from somewhere nearby. "There are others." Elise gasped as water threatened to spill into her mouth. "Railroad workers camped upstream. They've been fighting Amos in court for months over land disputes." "Good," Tokala said grimly, freeing her right wrist as blood flowed from where the shackle had cut deepest. "We may need witnesses to what happened here." He moved to her left arm, working with increased urgency as the water continued its relentless climb. The ancient mortar proved more stubborn here, requiring him to chip away fragments, piece by piece, while Elise fought to keep her chin above the surface. "Why?" she asked, needing his voice to anchor her against the growing panic. "Why risk your life for a stranger?" Tokala paused in his work, meeting her eyes in the dim light. "Because a warrior who cannot protect the innocent has no honor. Because justice delayed is justice denied. And because I have seen what happens when evil men like Amos Voss believe themselves untouchable." The second spike came free with a grinding scrape of metal on stone. Elise's left arm fell limp, sending fresh waves of agony through muscles that had been strained in one position for weeks. But she could move both hands, now could help lift herself as Tokala worked on the ankle shackles that kept her tethered to the wall. The sound of approaching voices grew louder. Not the distant railroad crew, but closer footsteps splashing through the storm-flooded yard above. Tokala's head snapped up his warrior instincts, sensing danger long before it manifested. "He comes," Elise whispered, terror and hope warring in her voice. "Amos always checks on me when the weather turns bad to make sure I haven't drowned before he can sell me." Heavy footsteps crossed the barn floor overhead, accompanied by the voices of multiple men discussing horses and weather, and getting the job done before dawn. Tokala pressed himself against the wall beside the ladder, his tomahawk sliding silently from its sheath as he became one with the shadows. The waters rising faster than expected. Came Amos Voss's voice, carrying clearly through the gaps in the floorboards. Might drown before we're ready for her. Could save us the trouble, replied another voice, rough, careless, the tone of a hired killer. No. Amos's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. The buyers want them both alive. Premium prices for pregnant women, especially when there's no family to come looking. Besides, I have my reputation to consider. Can't have folks thinking I'm the kind of man who'd force himself on his own stepdaughter. From his hiding place, Tokala felt ice form in his veins. He had suspected Amos's involvement in human trafficking, but hearing the casual admission of rape and incest made his grip tighten on the tomahawk until his knuckles went white. What about that Indian trouble? Asked a third voice. You still think he's tracking you? Amos laughed, a sound like gravel grinding together. Tokala, he's long gone by now, assuming he survived the winter. Besides, even if he found this place, what's one broken-down savage against 3 armed men? Elise's eyes found Tokala's, across the shadows, seeing in his expression the same determination that had kept her alive through 4 weeks of hell. The water had reached her lower lip now, forcing her to tilt her head back at an uncomfortable angle just to breathe. Check on her, Amos ordered. Make sure she's still breathing. If she dies before we can deliver the goods, this whole operation was a waste. One of the men started down the ladder, his boots slipping on the wet rungs. Tokala tensed, ready to strike, but the sound of horses approaching through the storm made the descending figure pause. Unless someone's coming, called the man on the ladder. Probably just travelers seeking shelter. Amos said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. Jake, get back up here. We'll check on the merchandise later. As the 3 men hurried from the barn to investigate the approaching riders, Tokala emerged from his hiding place and waded quickly to Elise's side. Using both hands now, he worked frantically on the ankle shackles, while she struggled to keep her mouth above water. I heard what they said. She whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. About selling us both. About your sister. The final spike proved the most stubborn, driven deeper than the others into stone that seemed harder than iron. Tokala's knife blade chipped against the ancient rock, and he was forced to work by feel as the water rose above Elise's chin. She could no longer speak, could barely breathe as the contaminated flood lapped at her nose. With a final desperate application of force, the last spike broke free. Tokala hauled Elise against his chest, both of them gasping as they broke the surface together. Her legs, unused to bearing weight after weeks of imprisonment, buckled immediately. She would have collapsed back into the water if not for his supporting arms. Can you climb? He asked, eyeing the 10-foot ladder that led to freedom. Elise tried to take a step and nearly fainted as circulation returned to her deadened limbs. I don't think... My legs won't hold me. Thunder crashed overhead as Tokala lifted her onto his back, her arms wrapped around his neck in a grip tight enough to choke. The wooden ladder was slick with decades of accumulated grime, made treacherous by the rain that poured through gaps in the barn roof. Each rung creaked ominously under their combined weight. They were 3/4 of the way to the top when Tokala's foot slipped. He slammed against the ladder, his ankle twisting with a crack that sent lightning up his leg. Elise's grip tightened instinctively, nearly strangling him. But he gritted his teeth and continued climbing. As they finally emerged into the barn, proper rain lashing through the broken roof and wind howling like the voices of the damned, a shotgun blast shattered the night. The slug tore past Tokala's shoulder, close enough to burn, splintering the wooden beam behind them in an explosion of splinters. Well, well. Amos Voss called from the barn's entrance, his weapon already broken open for reloading. Looks like that broken-down savage found us after all. Jake Morrison and Cole Brennan flanked their employer like hunting hounds, their pistols drawn and ready. Jake was the older of the two, a grizzled killer in his 40s, whose gray beard couldn't hide the cruel set of his mouth. Cole was younger, leaner with the quick hands of a professional gunman, and eyes like chips of winter ice. "You boys might find this interesting," Amos said as he snapped fresh shells into his shotgun. "Our friend Tokala here has been hunting me for months, ever since I had his sister collected for our special clients." Tokala went rigid against Elise's back, and she felt the change in him like touching a live wire. "What did you say?" He whispered the words, carrying more menace than any shout. "Pretty little thing, that Winona," Jake said with a cruel grin. "Fought like a wildcat when we took her from the reservation. But the buyers like them, spirited pays better than the broken ones." "Course she didn't last long in the trade," Cole added. "Some girls just ain't built for that kind of work." But she earned her keep before the end. The revelation hit Tokala like a physical blow, staggering him more than any bullet could have. His sister hadn't died of starvation, as he'd believed she had been kidnapped, sold, brutalized, and murdered by the same network that now planned to claim Elise and her unborn child. "You see, Indian." Amos continued savoring every word like fine whiskey. "Your little rescue mission here is what we call ironic. You've been so busy hunting me for letting your sister starve, when all along I was the one who made sure she ate regular meals right up until the end." Fury filled Tokala's vision with red, but it was tempered by tactical awareness born of years as a warrior. Amos stood 20 yards away, with a loaded shotgun while his men flanked them with drawn pistols. Behind them lay the flooded cellar ahead, stretched open ground with no cover except for an overturned supply wagon near the tree line. "Now here's what's going to happen," Amos said, raising his weapon. "I'm going to kill you quick, savage, because I respect a man who fights for family. But the woman, she's going to live long enough to birth that baby, and then they're both going on the market. Consider it payment for all the trouble you've caused." Elise felt Tokala tense beneath her, his muscles coiling like a spring under pressure. When he moved, it was with the explosive speed of a striking snake, diving sideways as the shotgun boomed, carrying both of them behind a pile of grain sacks as pistol shots cracked through the storm. They rolled through the mud and debris, coming up against the barn's side wall as bullets thudded into the wood around them. One slug passed so close to Elise's face that she felt its wind. Another tugged at the fabric of her torn dress. The wagon. Tokala gasped, blood seeping through his buckskin shirt, where shotgun pellets had found their mark. "If we can reach the trees." But even as he spoke, they could hear the men spreading out to cut off escape routes. Jake's voice carried through the rain. "She's pregnant, boys. Can't run far or fast. Just keep them pinned until we can get a clean shot." Tokala's ankle screamed protest as he rose into a crouch, surveying their options with the tactical mind of a warrior. The overturned wagon lay 30 yards away, a long sprint across open ground, with no guarantee of reaching cover alive. Behind them, the flooding river had swollen beyond its banks, turning the valley into a treacherous maze of rushing water and hidden obstacles. "Can you run?" he asked Elise, noting how she favored her left side where old injuries still pained her. "I can try," she replied, her voice steadier than he had expected. "But Tokala, if something happens to me, promise me you'll make sure my baby gets away from these animals." Before he could respond, Cole Brennan appeared around the grain pile, his pistol leveled at Elise's swollen belly. "End of the line, folks," he said with a grin that showed gold teeth. Tokala's tomahawk flew in a perfect arc, catching Cole in the center of his forehead with a wet thud. The gunman dropped instantly, his unfired weapon spinning away across the muddy ground. "One down," Tokala muttered, retrieving his weapon as blood ran from the split skull. But their momentary advantage was shattered by Jake Morrison's appearance at the barn's rear entrance, his gun already tracking toward them. This time, there was no cover, no clever tactics, just the simple equation of bullets versus flesh. Elise surprised them both by lunging for Cole's dropped pistol, her hands closing around the grip just as Jake's finger tightened on the trigger. The two shots came almost simultaneously, Jake's bullet scoring a groove across Tokala's ribs, while Elise's wild shot took the gunman in the shoulder and spun him around. "Where did that come from?" Tokala asked, impressed despite their desperate situation. "My father taught me to shoot when I was 12. Elise replied, her voice shaking with adrenaline. Said frontier women needed to know how to protect themselves. But their temporary victory was shattered by Amos Voss's approach and the landowner emerging from the storm like an avenging demon. His shotgun was reloaded, his face twisted with murderous fury, and his eyes burned with the light of madness. "Enough games." He snarled, the weapon trained on them with deadly precision. Time to end this charade. The river lay beyond the trees, its waters swollen with runoff from the mountain storms. Even in daylight and calm weather, crossing would be dangerous in the dark. With the current running high and angry, it might well prove fatal. But as Amos raised his shotgun for a killing shot, Tokala knew they had no other choice. He lifted Elise in his arms and ran for the water. The forest pressed close around them as they stumbled through underbrush, made treacherous by the storm. Behind them, Amos's curses grew louder as he crashed through the trees in pursuit, his injured shoulder making it difficult to reload while moving. But the sound of his approach never seemed to fade, never fell far enough behind to offer real hope of escape. "I can't keep up." Elise gasped, one hand pressed to her side where a stitch burned like fire. "The baby? Something's wrong." Tokala could see the truth in her face. The pale complexion and the way she moved, with increasing stiffness, the growing frequency of her sharp intakes of breath. Labor was beginning, triggered by stress and physical trauma, and there was nothing either of them could do to stop it. "Hold on," he said, lifting her again despite the protest from his wounded shoulder. "The river's just ahead." The sound of rushing water grew louder as they approached the bank, but so did the sound of their pursuer. A shotgun blast shattered tree bark just above their heads, close enough to shower them with splinters. Amos was gaining ground, his superior knowledge of the terrain offsetting their head start. When they reached the riverbank, Tokala's heart sank. The normally placid stream had become a raging torrent, swollen by mountain runoff, until it was 50 yards across and moving with the force of an avalanche. Debris tumbled in the current, whole trees, boulders, the scattered remains of someone's cabin, torn loose by the flood. "I can't swim," Elise said, staring at the water in terror. "Not like this, not with the baby coming." "Then hold tight to me," Tokala replied, stepping into the current that immediately tried to sweep his feet away. "And whatever happens, don't let go." The water was cold enough to stop the heart, fed by snowmelt from peaks that never saw summer warmth. Tokala waded deeper, fighting to keep his footing, as the river clawed at his legs with the strength of a living thing. When the current reached his waist, he lifted Elise higher, holding her head above the surface as he pushed toward the center of the stream. Halfway across the river they went under together, tumbling in the dark water as the current carried them downstream toward rocks that jutted from the riverbed like broken teeth. Tokala fought to keep his grip on Elise, to keep her head above water, but the cold sapped strength from his muscles, and the current battered them against submerged obstacles. He felt Elise's body convulse as a contraction ripped through her, her face going white with pain and oxygen deprivation. Water filled her mouth as she tried to scream, and for a terrifying moment, Tokala thought he was about to watch her drown in his arms. Then his feet found purchase on the rocky bottom. With a desperate surge of effort fueled by pure determination, he pushed upward, breaking the surface with Elise clutched against his chest. She coughed up river water, her breathing ragged, but her eyes were open and aware. The current had carried them nearly 100 yards downstream, but the far bank was only a few feet away. Tokala dragged them both onto the muddy shore, collapsing beside Elise as she curled around her belly with both arms. "The baby," she gasped between contractions that were coming faster now. It's happening." But before Tocala could respond, a shadow fell across them both. Amos Voss stood on the bank where they had just left, his clothes soaked from his own, crossing his shotgun, aimed directly at their exhausted forms. "I thought you were clever, didn't you?" he called across the narrow strip of water. "But there's nowhere left to run, and I'm getting tired of this game." He waded into the river, the current chest-deep, where he crossed his weapon held high to keep the powder dry. Tocala struggled to rise, but blood loss and exhaustion had left him weak as a newborn foal. His knife was lost somewhere in the crossing, and his tomahawk had been dropped during their tumultuous journey downstream. Amos reached the bank and grabbed Tocala by his long hair, forcing his head down into the shallow water. The Lakota warrior fought back, but his strength was nearly gone. Water filled his lungs as consciousness began to fade, and through the growing darkness, he could hear Elise calling his name. Then the world exploded in sound and light. Amos screamed, releasing his hold as he staggered backward with blood pouring from his shattered thigh. Jake Morrison's pistol, lost when he fell to Elise's shot, had been carried downstream by the current and lodged against a fallen log. Elise had spotted it in the pale dawn light that was just beginning to filter through the storm clouds, and somehow found the strength to retrieve it, despite her weakened condition. "You killed my mother," she said, the smoking weapon clutched in her trembling hands. "You destroyed my family, stole my innocence, and tried to sell my child like livestock. But you made one mistake, Amos Voss." The landowner collapsed in the shallows, his lifeblood mixing with the river water as he tried to staunch the wound. But the damage was too severe, the femoral artery torn beyond repair by the close-range blast. "What mistake?" he gasped, his face already taking on the gray pallor of approaching death. "You forgot that even caged birds remember how to bite." As the light faded from Amos's eyes, the sound of approaching voices carried across the watermen, calling out in response to the gunshot, their lanterns bobbing through the trees like earthbound stars. The railroad crew that emerged from the forest had been weathering the storm in their camp a half-mile upstream, building tracks through territory that Amos Voss had claimed through fraudulent surveys and forged deeds. 6 men strong and accustomed to frontier violence, they quickly assessed the situation and took control with practiced efficiency. "Mother of God," breathed their foreman, Patrick O'Malley, as he knelt beside Elise. His weathered Irish face was grave with concern as he noted her condition. The torn dress, the infected wounds on her wrists, the obvious signs of advanced labor. "What devil did this to you, lass?" Between contractions that were coming every few minutes now, Elise told her story in halting gasps. The railroad men listened with growing outrage. They had been fighting Amos's legal challenges for months, dealing with sabotage and intimidation that had cost them time, money, and the life of a young worker who had fallen from a bridge when his safety rope was mysteriously cut. "So it was Voss behind all our troubles," O'Malley muttered. "Should have known that snake was playing every angle." While 2 men tended to Tocala's wounds and helped him to a sheltered spot beneath an overhanging rock, another rode hard for Cinderbluff. He returned before the sun was fully up, leading Sheriff Tom Bradley and 2 deputies through the morning mist that had replaced the violent storm of the night. Bradley was a decent man, trapped in a corrupt system, honest enough to investigate crimes, but lacking the political power to pursue the territory's most influential citizens. The scene at the river, combined with Elise's testimony and the physical evidence of her imprisonment, gave him everything he needed to act. Trafficking, rape, kidnapping, attempted murder, Bradley said, making careful notes in his soggy journal. "And that's just what we can prove happened here. God only knows how deep this corruption runs." Jake Morrison was found unconscious, but alive near the overturned wagon, his shoulder wound severe but not fatal. Under interrogation, he revealed details of the trafficking network that stretched across 3 territories, naming names and describing operations that would keep federal marshals busy for months. As for Tocala, his legal status remained complicated. The assault on the federal agent still carried a warrant, and the violence of the night's events only added to his charges. But something had shifted in Cinder Bluff. The revelation of Amos's crimes, combined with the railroad crew's testimony about the Lakota warrior's heroic rescue of Elise, had changed public opinion. The way I see it. Sheriff Bradley told the assembled crowd outside his office 3 days later, "This man risked his life to save a woman and child from a monster who'd been poisoning our community for years. Whatever he did before that night, he more than answered for it with his courage." Samuel Harper entered the world on a bed of clean blankets in the railroad camp's medical tent, attended by Mary O'Malley, and watched over by women who understood what it meant to survive in an unforgiving land. The labor was difficult, complicated by weeks of poor nutrition and the trauma of the escape. But both mother and child emerged healthy. "He's perfect," Elise whispered, cradling the tiny form against her chest as dawn broke clear and bright over the mountains. Completely perfect. The baby opened his eyes green like his mother's, thankfully, and seemed to study her face with an awareness that defied his newborn state. For a moment, Elise feared she might see traces of Amos Voss in those features, but all she found was innocence and possibility. Tokala sat beside the bed, his shoulder bound with clean bandages and his ankle splinted with carved wood and leather strips. The physical wounds were healing well, but deeper scars remained from learning the truth about his sister's fate. Knowing that Winona had been sold into sexual slavery before her murder had shattered something inside him that might never fully mend. "She would have loved him," he said quietly, watching the baby's tiny fingers curl around Elise's thumb. "Winona always said children were the future of our people. All our people, not just the Lakota." "What will you do now?" Elise asked. "When your wounds heal and the legal troubles are settled?" Tokala was quiet for a long moment, considering. The federal authorities had arrived from Denver 2 days ago, bringing news that the agent he had assaulted was deeply involved in Amos's network. Charges were being quietly dropped in exchange for his cooperation in identifying other victims and testifying against the surviving conspirators. "I have been thinking about that," he said finally. "This child will need protection in a world that judges by blood rather than character. You will need allies who understand that some fights are worth having regardless of what the law says." Elise studied his scarred face, seeing not the savage that others feared, but a man who had sacrificed everything for justice. "Are you proposing something, Tokala, of the Lakota?" "I propose that we build something new together. Not just for ourselves, but for all the broken people who need somewhere safe to heal. A place where orphaned children can learn skills that will serve them in any world, where women fleeing violence can find protection, where displaced families can maintain their traditions while adapting to change." The idea took root in Elise's mind, like a seed in fertile soil. She had witnessed the worst that humanity could offer in Amos's cellar, but she had also seen the best in Tokala's courage and the railroad workers' kindness. Perhaps it was possible to create something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. "It would be dangerous work," she said. "Powerful men won't like having their victims find sanctuary." "Well, then we'll make sure our sanctuary has teeth," Tokala replied with a grim smile. "I know others like me, warriors without tribes, lawmen without badges, good people who've been branded outlaws for fighting corruption. Together, we could build something that lasts." Outside the tent, the railroad crew was already back at work, laying track through land that was finally legally theirs. The sound of hammers on steel rang across the valley like a promise of progress, of connection, of a future where isolated communities could support each other against the darkness. 3 months later, that promise became reality. The Harper Tokala Ranch stretched across 1,000 acres of fertile valley land, purchased at auction from Amos Voss's seized estate, with funds provided by the railroad company, grateful townsfolk, and even some members of Tokala's former tribe who had heard the story of his redemption and chosen to support his new path. On the surface, it was a working cattle operation that employed settlers and Native Americans on equal terms, a radical concept that somehow worked because results spoke louder than prejudice. Beneath that surface, it served a more important purpose as sanctuary for those who had nowhere else to turn. Women fleeing abusive husbands found shelter in the ranch's fortified compound, protected by men who understood that some battles were worth fighting regardless of legal opinion. Native families displaced by corrupt agents discovered a place where they could maintain their customs while learning skills needed in the changing world. Children orphaned by violence or disease grew up by cultural learning to read and write from Elise, while mastering hunting and tracking from Tocala. The main house was a sprawling log structure built for defense, as well as comfort with heavy shutters that could stop bullets, and a stone foundation that contained hidden rooms for those who needed to disappear quickly. The barn held not just livestock, but a printing press that produced a weekly newspaper documenting territorial corruption, and the root cellar served as a way station for the informal network that helped escaped slaves reach freedom in Canada. Elise had proven herself a natural administrator, her education helping her navigate the complex legal and financial challenges of running such an operation. The trauma of her captivity had left permanent scars. She still startled at unexpected sounds, still checked multiple times each night to ensure Samuel was safe in his crib. But she had found purpose in helping others heal from similar wounds. Tocala had settled into the role of protector and teacher, his skills as tracker and warrior making him invaluable when runaways needed to be retrieved or threats dealt with. More importantly, he had become a bridge between worlds, helping Native families understand settler law while teaching white children to respect the land and its original inhabitants. The relationship between Elise and Tocala had evolved, slowly built on shared trauma and mutual respect rather than passion. They had become partners, in the truest sense, two wounded souls who found healing in service to others, two survivors who chose to build something beautiful from the wreckage of their separate tragedies. On Samuel's second birthday, as the boy took his first tentative steps between his mother's arms and Tocala's waiting hands, both adults understood they had created something neither could have achieved alone. The child would grow up knowing two languages, two cultures, two ways of understanding the world. And perhaps that dual perspective would help him build bridges his parents' generation had thought impossible. He'll be strong, Tocala observed, catching the giggling boy as he stumbled forward. Strong enough to carry both our people's hopes. More importantly, he'll be free. Elise replied, watching her son's joy with the fierce protectiveness that had sustained her through weeks of hell. Free to choose his own path, make his own mistakes, build his own future. Sheriff Bradley rode up to the main house as evening shadows lengthened his horse, tired from a day of tracking rustlers in the high country. He had become a regular visitor to the ranch, partly for official business, but mostly because he valued the friendship of people who understood that justice and law weren't always the same thing. Word from the federal marshal in Denver. He reported accepting coffee and a seat on the porch. They broke up another trafficking ring using information from Voss's records. Saved 23 women and children, including 5 Lakota girls who'd been missing for over 2 years. Tocala's expression darkened at the news. Each rescued victim was a victory, but also a reminder of Winona and the countless others who hadn't been found in time. The buyers, some of them, Bradley admitted. Mostly wealthy men who thought money made them untouchable. But the marshals are patient folks, and they're building cases that'll put important people behind bars. Your testimony helped make that possible. As they talked about politics and justice, about the territory's future and the ranch's role in shaping it, Samuel played quietly at their feet with wooden toys carved by Tocala's patient hands. The boy was learning to speak in both English and Lakota, to identify tracks in the dust and letters on a page, to understand that the world held both beauty and danger in equal measure. It was a peaceful scene, the kind that frontier families dreamed of, achieving safety, prosperity, hope for the next generation. But it had been built on a foundation of violence, overcome trauma, transformed into strength two broken people who chose healing over hatred. The Harper Tocala Ranch would continue to grow and thrive, eventually encompassing 3,000 acres and employing over 100 people from a dozen different backgrounds. Samuel would grow up to become a territorial judge, using his unique perspective to bridge the gap between settler law and native justice. The sanctuary would save hundreds of lives over the coming decades, providing refuge and resources to those who had nowhere else to turn. But on that quiet evening, as stars began to appear in the darkening sky and fireflies danced among the cottonwood trees, the future was still unwritten. What mattered was the present moment. A child playing safely at his guardian's feet, surrounded by people who had learned to value justice over prejudice, love over fear. As Elise carried a sleepy Samuel inside for the night, and Tocala made his rounds to check the security of their sanctuary, and Sheriff Bradley rode back toward town with news of small victories in the endless war against corruption, the ranch settled into peaceful darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, fresh opportunities to help the helpless and fight for the forgotten. But tonight, they could rest in the knowledge that they had answered hatred with hope, that they had taken something terrible and made it beautiful, and that the boy sleeping in the nursery would grow up truly free from the chains of the past, free to build an even better future. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl answered with its ancient wisdom. The frontier was still wild, still dangerous, but no longer without hope for those brave enough to fight for it. And in that fight perhaps lay the true meaning of freedom.